we're on the precipice of a cultural shift around disability. Even you having a podcast called Disabled and Proud may not have existed.
Oh no, and I completely agree with you. Like, even 10 years ago, we wouldn't have been having this conversation, let alone two disabled women having this conversation.
I can appreciate that both you and I are coming into perspectives both as disabled women, but coming in with different perspectives as someone who was born with their disability versus someone who acquired mine as a kid. And you can even have guests who are people who have disabilities who acquired them as an adult. Maybe they had their entire careers and also had a shift and adjustment that needed to be made too.
Oh my goodness gracious me, Tiffany Yu, author of the Anti-Ableism Manifesto. Welcome to Disabled and Proud.
Yay, I'm so excited to be here.
I am so excited to delve into so much with you today. Talk about Anti-Ableism Manifesto, to talk about diversibility, talk about you as an author as well. There's going to be so much to cover, and I am so excited to have you here on the pod today. It's going to be amazing.
Yay. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah. So, I don't know if you ever listened to this podcast before, but the first question that I ask absolutely everybody is, how do you refer to your disability?
Ooh. So I identify as having both apparent and non-apparent disabilities. So I live with post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a mental health disability that came about as a result of a car accident, which caused my physical apparent disability, which is a paralyzed arm, also known as a brachial plexus injury. But outside of those specific diagnoses, I just identify as disabled.
Yeah. And I love that as well, because in the UK, like, I would never say like apparent and non-apparent. And is that maybe like the American way of saying visible, invisible, hidden, unhidden? Because there are so many different terminologies for it, right?
Yeah. So language is evolving. And as you have alluded to, non-apparent disabilities are also known as invisible or hidden disabilities. But part of why I use non-apparent is that hidden disabilities may have an undertone that someone is trying to hide their disability, which they're not. And invisible disability also may suggest that someone who has a disability feels invisible within our community more than they already are.
Yeah. And I love what you just said about language evolving, because I think people get so scared about terminology to use and how words evolve and what's, technically politically correct anymore, and how do we go with that. But actually, like you said, like, language is consistently evolving, and it's kind of just about keeping up with it, which, don't get me wrong, can be really overwhelming when you first dive into it. But I'm so glad that you hit that point specifically. When it comes to school, I want to go back to school. What was Tiffany like when she was at school?
Ooh, do you want to know Tiffany pre-disabled or post-accident times?
Do you know what? Maybe like a little snippet of each Tiffany, and how there was maybe a change or not so much a change. What was that experience like for you?
Sure. So Tiffany pre 9 years old, my pre-disabled times, I call them, I was taking ballet classes, diving lessons with my siblings, learning to play the violin and piano, and I have vivid memories of rock climbing at friends' birthday parties.
Yeah.
Post 9-year-old Tiffany, still a kid on paper.
Yeah.
I feel like she didn't know how to process. So for those who are new to my story, I got into a car accident. My dad was driving at the time. He unfortunately passed away. And all of that happened when I was 9. And I think 9-year-old post Tiffany didn't know anyone else who had lost a parent at the time. Didn't understand what grief was or what that could look like. And was literally just trying to survive in this new disabled body of, how do I relearn how to do all of the things that I love to do? One of the things that I love to do with my dad was go biking. And so yeah, it would take me a long time to rediscover how to bike or go rock climbing again, probably almost 20 years.
Yeah.
But post 9-year-old Tiffany felt like she couldn't be a kid anymore. Felt like what she had experienced made it so that she was experiencing adult things in a child's body.
Yeah, like you had to grow up super, super quick because life changed like literally on the flip of a coin.
Yeah.
Like my little heart breaks for like little like 9-year-old Tiffany, mainly because like I'm a sporty person, and the idea of like having to relearn how to do sports, I think for me would be something that I would find quite difficult, because like I obviously don't know life without a disability. So like my life has always been kind of steeped in disability, right? Like I didn't get a choice, but like, you know, I'm pickled in this stuff. And then to try and like relearn, and especially at 9 years old, which is such a formative age, right? Because you're kind of coming out of childhood, kind of into those like pre-teen years where you're kind of to notice your body a bit as well. So you've got all of those like hormonal changes that are about to happen. And you've just had this like absolutely catastrophic accident where life has literally completely changed. You've done like a 360, 180. Maths has never really been my strong suit, so I'm sure it's somewhere in between those numbers. And to try and relearn all that stuff must have been just kind of overwhelming. And what you said about experiencing and almost being an adult in a child's body is something that I think would really resonate with a lot of people, because I think that's exactly how it feels when you're young and you go through something that big.
Yeah, and one of the things it wasn't like, I can even remember the date. So the car accident was in 1997, and the first time I ever tried something active in this disabled body was 2015. And it just so happened that I slipped on a rock, so I was just attempting to flail around and swim.
Yeah.
And so I look back to that time, because if I had known about the Paralympic movement, if I had known about adaptive sports, or, you know, I see so many kids now and so many amazing nonprofits that are helping to support kids and adults learn more about adaptive sports and the fact that sports are accessible to everyone. But I think at that point in time, almost 30 years ago, my family and I were just not aware of any of those resources that were available.
Yeah. And also the likenesses 30 years ago, those resources were probably pretty thin on the ground. Like disability sports has come so far, even in the past 10 years, that what is now available was not available then. And like it's insane how much there has been a massive jump forward in terms of like technology and sports and everything for the disabled like lifestyle.
Yeah.
But like 30 years ago, like you're right, it was so thin on the ground, like it didn't exist.
And also 30 years ago, we were not talking about disability in the way that we are now. Exactly like you said, I actually believe that we are on the cusp of we're on the precipice of a cultural shift around disability. Even you having a podcast called Disabled and Proud may not have existed. Probably wouldn't, and I don't even know if podcasts, it's probably some audio, I mean, audiobooks definitely existed, but moving into a podcast type format probably didn't become popular until much later.
Oh no, and I completely agree with you. Like even 10 years ago, we wouldn't have been having this conversation, let alone two disabled women having this conversation. Like, don't want to say it, but it's kind of revolutionary. Like that's where we're at right now for us.
Yes. Even existing, and I can appreciate that both you and I are coming into perspectives both as disabled women, but coming in with different perspectives as someone who was born with their disability versus someone who acquired mine as a kid. And you can even have guests who are people who have disabilities who acquired them as an adult. Maybe they had their entire careers and also had a shift and adjustment that needed to be made too.
Yeah, and that's so true. And that's why I love these conversations, right? Because everybody approaches disability in a completely different way. And I always say, like, just because you've met one disabled person doesn't mean that you've met the entire disabled community, because we're not a monolith. Like, we're not one size fits all. not everybody feels the same way about their disability. And also how people relate to their disability is completely different, right? Is that you and I, for example, could have the exact same disability on paper, you know, like word for word, identical, like complete same diagnosis, complete same doctor's reports, and how we live our lives, how we go about our day to day, and how we interact with each other and the outside world is going to be so vastly different that we need to realize we're not just this like one size fits all. Oh, disability's a box, let's whack it in it, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
So when you were at school and then you went on to university, what was that like for you in terms of your career choices around your disability? Was it something that you had to think of?
Ooh, good question. I I will say, so I became disabled at 9, but I did not identify as disabled until maybe I was 21.
Wow, so that's like what, 11 years?
12 years.
Told
And
you maths was not my strong suit.
11 to 12 years, 10 plus years, I guess we'll say. And
Yeah.
part of why I bring that up is because
Mm-hmm.
I had no disability community and I had no consciousness around my disability other than
Mm-hmm.
describing it. And now I used to describe my disabled arm as my funny hand.
Uh-huh.
And now I would go back and edit that because I don't want anyone to describe my body as funny, nor would I
Mm-hmm.
describe anyone else's body as funny. Or I would think about my arm as the arm that didn't work.
Yeah.
And I guess because growing up, I had internalized so much shame and stigma around identifying as
Mm-hmm.
disabled, I didn't, which also
Yeah.
meant that accommodations or even adaptations or even adaptive sports, like we were talking about, didn't feel like they were accessible to me because I didn't even go out seeking those resources. So fast forward moving into university, I I guess I had always thought about leaning into professions that didn't require, I don't know, package delivery.
Mm-hmm.
I probably wouldn't wouldn't do. Uh, what else would I do? I don't know, maybe like folding a lot of clothes, carrying laundry baskets.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so so I naturally found myself wanting to study something business related. And originally
Uh-huh.
I started thinking maybe I'll do marketing, which now in retrospect, social media is a job that didn't even exist when I was getting ready to go to university. So that could have been
Yeah.
interesting. But I ended up deciding to study finance and accounting because I had to take a mandatory accounting 101 class my first year. And for those who do like maths,
Which
my
isn't me.
my financial statements all flowed together very beautifully, and my
Mm-hmm.
balance sheet balanced, and that just felt really exciting and rewarding to me. So I said, you know what?
Mm-hmm.
I really like understanding how these financial statements work, how they drive business decisions. Let me dig more into this. I guess
Yeah.
where my disability came, where I felt confronted by it was by deciding to pursue financial services or looking for internships at investment
Mm-hmm.
banks. Networking events were a huge part of them, and I'm a
Yeah.
left-handed handshaker. And so it would be immediate upon the introduction that I shake hands with you differently. And
Mm-hmm.
again, at that point in time of looking for internships, I didn't have language. I didn't have a way to tell people about the car accident without crying up until that
Yeah.
point in time.
Yeah.
So it was always just shifty eyes, stares, elephant in the
Mm-hmm.
room, left-handed handshake. I'm just trying to get an interview for an internship.
Yeah, of course. And like I'm a left-handed shaker as well because my right hand doesn't exist. But like completely different, like different set of situations and circumstances to you is that like I'm always like, well, I can't shake with my right, so you're gonna have to deal with it. And like, but because I have never had
the option to shake with the right. And so that's like, again, so interesting because there are so many like similarities and differences between the two of us and this story. And I'm just like loving hearing all about it.
Well, one thing that was interesting too was even after my injury with my paralyzed hand, there was a period of time where I was still attempting to shake people's hands with my right paralyzed hand. And
Wow.
and that's fine. That's fine if that's what you want to do.
Yeah.
But it just, like, I became a very confident left-handed handshaker. I learned to say, okay, I'm not exuding who I want to be by shaking your hand with my paralyzed arm. So let me try something different, which is, can I shake your hand with my left hand and do it in a way that I feel like is who I want to be in this situation?
Yeah. And also there's like a level of comfortability, isn't there, as well? And kind of like growing your own confidence in who you are and kind of coming into the world, particularly like the working world as a disabled woman, whether you had that language and vocabulary or not. My God, I'm really stumbling over my words today. But being able to do that, actually, it's kind of like a show and a mark of like you growing as well. And something that you said earlier is that you didn't really try, or not try is not the right word because I was thinking about sports, hence the word try, but that you didn't really think about your disabled body until you were like in your early 20s. And that's kind of like the age of the world where you come inside the working world and you're kind of semi at uni or at college. And at that time, what was it that kind of made you have the conversations about using words like disability, or being comfortable to maybe have that conversation to say, do you know what, like I have got a disability and this is something that I need to talk about or move forward with? What was that experience like?
So I was successful in my confident left-handed handshake, and I got an internship working in investment banking at Goldman Sachs. And I bring that up because while I was there as an intern, as a summer intern, I got introduced to their women's employee resource group and the one for their Asian employees. And they had one for disabled employees and caregivers and people who support us. And so that was the first time where I was now in this community, in this investment bank. Again, I'm a summer intern. I'm the most junior, maybe even I'm sub entry level. and I'm meeting I'm meeting very senior people at this bank who are becoming my mentors or cheering me on or being, again, an additional resource or support outside of my direct investment banking department. And when I left Goldman, I was now in my final year at university. I looked back at that experience, and that was the first time I felt a little bit more embraced in my disability experience. I guess one other memory that's coming up for me is there's a nonprofit here in the US that partners with a lot of large corporations and banks. And at the time, they used to host networking sessions for their disabled students to go meet with recruiters at these different companies.
Oh, wow.
And when I showed up at one of their recruitment events, again with my left-handed handshake, it was the first time, and I talk about this in the book, it was the first time I experienced access intimacy, which is this term that is coined by Mia Mingus. And my version of access intimacy is I'm showing up at a place and I don't have to ask for permission to show up. And it's not weird the way I'm doing things because everyone is showing up in their own way. And we all have different diverse disabilities. Again, we're not a monolith and we're all navigating that environment in different ways. But that space was made with us in mind so that when I showed up, I gave my left-handed handshake and I didn't think anything of it. And then we jumped right into the conversation about the internships. So I feel like being able to, number one, start to go to networking sessions that were made for a disabled candidate from the ground up. You know, we talk about like building accessibility first, accessibility first. And then going into my summer internship at my dream bank which at the time, if you wanted to pursue a career in banking, that was one of the top banks to go to. I actually feel like that started to give me some confidence that, okay, like I'm able to show up at a recruiting session and not feel weird that I shake with my left hand. And now I'm at one of the best, in my mind, or at the time, one of the best investment banks. And I have a full-time offer in hand to go back. And I graduated right around the time of the 2008 financial crisis. So even that felt like I felt very lucky at the time.
Yeah.
But because I was now equipped with, I call these receipts. I was equipped with some
social proof.
Some social proof, some social capital behind me. I felt like I could now go back and explore, I guess, the parts of me that I felt shame around, which at this particular point in time was my physical disability, and say, okay, I'm ready. Now that I have this social proof, let me share more bits of this story and see if it resonates with other people, or even at the baseline, just acknowledge that this has impacted my life up until this particular point in time, or it's something I have to think about as I navigate daily life.
Yeah. And I really love that a lot of the social proof that you had early on actually came through work, because how often really is that the case, is that someone feels really welcomed in their work environment and is kind of given that support immediately, because, you know, we consistently talk and hear about, or particularly here in the UK, about how, you know, work environments don't necessarily suit the disabled individual. And there's so much conversation around that, and there is so much writing and legislation that needs to be done. But I really love how your kind of first evidence of social proof and like receipts, as you said, like came from work and networking groups. And actually, how beautiful is that? Like the thing that we're all slating at the minute, which absolutely fair, there are reasons to have those views and feel that way. How beautiful is that your first like evidence of social proof and connection came from the working world? Like that is amazing.
Yeah. And you know what? I hadn't thought about it that way. And ideally, I would love us to find our value and our worth internally, but sometimes it might be an external thing. And one of the things I do talk about is I do feel like an exception. And I think part of why I've dedicated so much of my life to this work around closing the disability employment gap is that I've had an opportunity to meet us. I love us. Yeah. I'm so proud of our community. There's so much magic and talent among all of us. And yet, whether we have the legislation or not, and this is actually why I wrote my book. In the UK, and the book is launching in the UK in March. So this is why we're
honestly chatting. Couldn't be more perfect timing, if you ask me.
and it's timing because, and I was doing research, there's the Equality Act 2010, which followed up to this Disability Discrimination Act before. And in the US, we're celebrating 35 years of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which feels similar.
Yeah.
We've had legislation in place in the UK for now 15 years, in the US for now 35 years. We are still not getting hired. So it made me think, what needs to change? And as much as I love and advocate for policy change, and we do need that in place, if you still do not fundamentally believe in your heart and your mind and your attitudes that disabled people are valuable and worthy and talented and exist everywhere and belong everywhere, then you are not going to implement and execute those policies, and they'll fall flat, which is what we're seeing play out right before our eyes. So the book essentially says, okay, to create the type of systemic change that we dream about, it needs to be a combination of policy change plus the attitudinal change as well. So we have policies in place. They're just not being enforced because people still don't fully believe that we are whole human beings. And and here in the US, we're in a sensitive political climate now where we're, saying horrific things about the disability community is becoming
normal.
Okay, or modeled by senior leadership, I guess I'll say.
And you know what? That's so true, that it's a really tricky landscape in the US at the minute, because there's this whole thing of like, is DE and I dead? Or I always say DE and I, and then other people say EDI, and I'm like, what was EDI? And I realized it's the same thing, but just like jumbled up in a different way. But there is that conversation: is it dead now? And it, like you said, like, it's a very, very difficult landscape to traverse, particularly in the US right now with everything that's going on in terms of its political landscape. It's a bit of a minefield. So
yes, I like how you described it as a minefield, because, and I was talking to my disabled friend about this last night. I think the plan, or not the plan, I think what's happening is mass overwhelm and confusion to exhaustion. Like, we just do not know. We don't know anything, and we're so confused that we're exhausted.
And that's true.
And we have to think about how do we sustain ourselves through this, right? Because we still need the collective. So
it's minefield, absolute minefield. And I really like what you said there about how do you sustain yourself during this period of time, because it's not easy to listen to every single day, particularly if it's coming from like leaders and politicians, right? That's hard work because they kind of hold the purse strings. And so I like what you said there about, how do we find a way to sustain ourselves? Not necessarily like a movement or a place, like how do we sustain ourselves and make ourselves feel comfortable, feel safe when we're not necessarily getting externally. We have to kind of dig deep internally, which in and of itself is inherently exhausting. And so I really salute all of like my American friends, people who listen to this podcast in America. Like, I'm here, I'm with you. I got your back. I don't know what I can do, but like, I'm here to fight the good fight. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. And this has impacts globally as well, right? I mean, the word tariffs thrown everywhere.
Scary.
And yeah, and you know what? I actually think that our sustainability is through our pride, and is through sitting in joy and exploring what that looks like for us.
There is honestly nothing more gorgeous than disabled joy. Like, literally nothing on this planet is more gorgeous than disabled joy, especially like, this is kind of like the cherry on top. If you can do it in somebody who's incredibly ableist's face, that, oh my God, absolute gorgeous. And I love it. And I love watching it. And I love seeing it when it happens. And I'm like, yes, happiness and joy you are allowed to experience if you're disabled. It is a gorgeous, gorgeous feeling. And it's one of the most incredible things in the entire world. I love it.
And if you do it with someone who was ableist, maybe it starts to shift what harmful stereotypes they had about who they thought we were.
And that is it right there. It's that changing in perception, because that's what it's all about at the end of the day. But I think we should maybe jump into the Anti-Ableism Manifesto, because my goodness gracious me, it is an absolute feat. It is a whopper of a book. And I went through it yesterday. And there is so much that you have covered in the fact that it's like one book is firstly incredible. I think it would have taken me about 10 books to write what you have written. But obviously we've spoken about the reasons to why you've written it. But when it comes to like distilling that information down, what was that process like? How did you write down this section is going to be about this? Section 2 is going to be about something completely different. Section 3 is going to be about something complete. How was that process for you, and what does that look like?
This a couple of years ago, actually, I want to say probably about 10 years ago, when I decided I wanted to be more active in social impact spaces, I started joining a lot of different social change and social impact communities. And I learned about this framework called Me, We, Us, about how we can create transformative change. It starts with me, then it's we, and then it's us. And I'm making hand gestures. By me, I'm pointing to myself or pointing to you. We is in community with each other, and then us is more broadly as a global society or a broader society. And that became the framework for the book. So section 1, even as we have talked about in this, we started this podcast episode by talking very briefly about language. So there is a chapter about, there's a chapter, I think it's called Not All Disabilities Are Apparent. It talks about why I use non-apparent disability. That term, over, hidden, or invisible, goes into some of the underpinnings there. It talks about language, inclusive language. So that first section is me, AKA you. Here are the things here's the individual research you can do to learn about ableism and anti-ableism. Then section 2 to me was about thinking about really common microaggressions that we as disabled people experience, whether it's people giving us unsolicited advice or making assumptions about our experience or asking us intrusive questions. So section 2 is really, what can we do in community with each other? How do we interrupt microaggressions when they happen? And then the third section was, now that we have done the work internally and in relationship with each other, what can we do? What policies can we implement in our spaces with a leaning toward work? And I loved that. And actually, I may now carry in your observation of how my disability identity came from work. And so I talk a lot about how I do believe that part of where many of us who do want to work, that's where we find community. It's where we feel like we're contributing to society. It's where we feel valued. And if we don't have access to work, which a lot of us don't, then we lose some of that and have to find that value and that community elsewhere. So section 3 is about more on what can we do organizationally and as a broader society. So that's how I thought about the book. I mean, I will say on a baseline level, one of the things that I did that helped me determine that this is the framework we were going to use is I went to go look back. So now I do some work around supporting corporations who maybe want to maybe are learning about disability inclusion and what they can do to be to create more psychological safety in their workspaces for disabled employees. So I took one of my corporate presentations and I just spoke it out loud, and I noticed that the framework that my corporate presentations flowed was also me, we, us. And so then I was like, you know what, this framework is going to work for this. And so in the introduction of the book, I introduced that framework, me, we, us. And for the purposes of clarity, I've renamed the 3 sections to Anti-Ableism and You, that's the me, Anti-Ableism and Your Community, that's the we, and then Anti-Ableism and Societal Change, that's the us.
I love that you follow that structure. And it's really interesting for me because I always say when I'm talking to people about disability or having these types of conversations, it's never about the me, it's about the we. And I have said that for years and years and years. And it's the first time that I've heard someone distill it down as to why that change and that kind of, trickle down route is important. So firstly, thank you for that, because I feel like I just had like a mini brain explosion and I'm like, oh my goodness gracious. I knew this all along. But actually, in terms of how you've distilled the information down, I think it's really brilliant to start with yourself first, because you can't put on somebody else's oxygen mask before you put on your own. Like, that's futile. And I love that that's what you start with, because it's really important to look at your own beliefs, your own unconscious bias, because believe it or not, like, we all have unconscious bias, which can be really uncomfortable to confront, but your book kind of gives you a helping hand. So being able to kind of navigate that and go through that journey with the book is actually really beautiful. And I love that that's how it's separated. Interestingly, I'm interested to know, what was the most challenging part of the book to write?
Ooh. So you're going to get a little bit of behind the scenes here, but I have you ever written a book?
No, and I don't know if I have the concentration span to do it. I think it would take me about 7 years.
Which actually I think is a pretty standard period of time for people to write their books, depending on, you know, how long they've been thinking about it. But yeah. I asked you that question because my publishing process was a bit unconventional, in the sense that there was a younger version of myself that thought maybe one day I'll write a book. But now in my late 30s, I hadn't really thought about younger Tiffany's dream. Yeah. And it just so happened that someone had been following my social media presence and been seeing what I was posting about online and reached out asking if I had thought about writing a book. I said, some high school version of Tiffany, some younger version of Tiffany did. Now I'm not sure I have the time. Like you said, not sure if I have the concentration, and also have a lot of imposter syndrome about, now in today's short-term attention economy, how do we take a 15-second TikTok or a 15-second TikTok series and turn that into a longer piece of narrative, or people who want to dive deeper into our written work. In addition to that, similar to you, I mean, I type with one hand. So I'm also just like, how am I going to write a book? But I'm getting a little long-winded. All of that to say, I think the hardest part about writing this book was that I started and didn't have a detailed table of contents. I had essentially this framework, me, we, us, but I didn't know all of the chapters that were going to go into it yet. And so I actually ended up writing the last chapter, which is Get Civically Engaged, first. And then I just sat on the draft for a long period of time because I'd already gotten to the punchline, chapter 34, and didn't have a roadmap per se of how I was going to get to that last chapter. But I'd already written the last chapter, so then I was like, I already know the ending. So I think really honing in on what are these 33 chapters preceding it going to look like, and what are the things I wish I could have included in here that I didn't. You know, there's a chapter I would have loved to include on dating and relationships, but I also know that my audience for this book is mainly DEI professional, if we want to call them that, or a professional who cares about inclusion and equity. So that didn't make it in the book, but I can refer you to at least 3 books off the top of my head that talk about disability and relationships specifically. And so I'm like, okay, we couldn't include everything in here, but I can go refer you to other resources for that. So I think that was the hardest part, was really honing in on the table of contents. And then the other part was more of a mindset shift to me, that I could become a writer as someone who wrote a book with one arm. And I actually, and this is accessibility for the win, I wrote the entire first draft of the book using speech to text technology. I use a tool called otter.ai. It's my favorite. Do you use speech to text?
No, I never use it. I sit there and I type away, and now I feel like I'm missing out on the biggest thing that could probably change my entire life.
Oh, well, I don't know about you. So one thing that happens in my brachial plexus injury community is, and I don't know if there's a formal term for it, but One is we get like texting thumb because we're always using the phone with one hand. And then the other is just overuse of our non-injured arm. And so I would prefer, so I was like, how am I going to type 90,000 words? I could
90,000 words. Oh my gosh.
I mean, I think the last time, maybe the most we were asked to write was like 1,000 for an article or a blog post somewhere, 500 to 1,000, but 90,000, that was a lot. And I said, typing that could be too much use on one hand.
Mm-hmm.
So I used speech to text, which is
incredible.
Yeah. And actually I got introduced to speech to text when I returned to Goldman full time. And every single new hire had an ergonomic assessment done of our workstation. So many of us got a keyboard wrist pad. I got a left-handed mouse. A lot of us got a second monitor, two computer screens. And I got a footstool because I'm petite and my feet were hanging off the chair. And then the ergonomic specialist asked if I would benefit from speech to text technology. And I had never heard of that at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And nor had it been actively offered to me. But she said, yeah, it's just a headset that you wear that whatever you say will convert it into text on your screen, and then you can go and edit it. And at the time, I decided not to use the speech to text. And I think with the emergence of Siri, if you have an Apple iPhone, and asking them to help you draft text messages, I've now become more used to asking tools, even, and I don't have an Alexa, but like asking an Alexa to play a song, or your Google Echo or Dot or whatever smart devices that are now letting us use our voice to dictate different commands. We can now use our voice to write large amounts of text.
Actually insane, like incredible, because again, like another work moment where work has been like, hey, like here's something you might like, and you're like, oh my goodness gracious, opened up a new world of possibilities, who would have thought? But also how incredible to write like a massive chunk of your book through your voice. And like obviously that is a lot of what writing is, but like actually quite literally through your voice. And that is something I think is absolutely gorgeous, like incredible.
I wanted the book to read as though a friend was talking to you. And
yeah, it does.
And the book, as you mentioned, like there's a lot of information in there, and it could have easily become overly academic. And so there was a part of me that said, how do I make sure I'm disseminating this information, but in a way that I hope lands with you? So even if I did, and I will say, when I first started the writing process, I wasn't using speech to text, and I had written chapter 30. I had typed out chapter 34.
Yeah.
And even when I went back through editing, I spoke that chapter. I would reread the chapter out loud, because sometimes the way we write and the way we talk are a little different. And how could I find that in between moment where it does feel like I'm talking to you as a friend, and I'm also taking into account that you're reading this, or you're listening to the audiobook, or you're engaging. Yeah, how can you engage with the text and still have it be approachable, digestible, and relatable?
Yeah. You mentioned a little TikTok series or like Insta series. Now, I'd love it if you could just mention what that was and how that all came about, because I followed it for a very long time.
I will say that for your listeners, I reached out to Brooke on LinkedIn, and I found that Brooke had already been following me, and you had been following me for a while, and I didn't realize, and I was like, oh, maybe she has some familiarity with my work already. So in December of 2020, I launched on TikTok and on Instagram later the Anti-Ableism series. And the Anti-Ableism series was, I started it mainly to keep myself accountable to making short form video content. But at a baseline level, I had wanted to figure out ways that I could answer the question, how can I show up better for the disability community? And depending on who you are, that answer is different.
Yeah.
And you'll notice the Anti-Ableism series, the Anti-Ableist Manifesto, there are connections, and there actually are references in the book to the TikTok and Instagram series. But the series has now over 300 parts. And
Insane.
I'm heading to the UK soon, and I'm hoping maybe if you and I meet, we can record a part of the series if you would like.
Oh my gosh, I think I would pass out, absolutely.
But similar to you having a podcast, and a podcast takes a ton of work. And so for me, I was thinking, how can I use my platform, my audience, to help amplify and platform other people who are doing great work in the space? But I don't have the energy to. I once upon a time did have a podcast, but it is a lot. So a lot of kudos to any podcast hosts or people who have podcasts out there. But yeah, the Anti-Ableism series, it was really, and I feel like part one was, how do you define disability? And then part two was, what is ableism? Part three was, hey, did you know that there are over 1 billion people globally who live with disabilities? I find it really hard to believe that over 1 billion of us are broken, or something's wrong with us, or that we need to be fixed. Like, that's a lot of people that would need to be fixed. Instead, how can we fix our external environment? Anyway, so all of that to say, again, there's no one way to show up better for a community. And all of us will have a different task at hand for how we can show up better. So if you are a hiring manager, what I will tell you to show up better is to look over your job descriptions and make sure they're not unintentionally excluding disabled people. Maybe double your hiring targets. If you are a podcast host, maybe I would tell you to make sure you have transcripts for your podcast, so that people who aren't able to listen to the audio can still engage with the content. If you're a content creator, it's to add image descriptions to your posts, which I would not tell a hiring manager to do. So again, and if you're a policymaker, that would be different too. So that was really, and I guess what I will introduce here, and I don't know if you do video or just audio, but at the end of the book, the Anti-Ableist Manifesto, I introduce this Anti-Ableist Manifesto art. And
I love that so much.
And it has almost 30 statements on here. And the statements say things like, disability is not a bad word or a bad thing. Nothing about us without us. Use your privilege. And invest in disabled entrepreneurs, hire us. And the statements on here actually correspond with the chapters in the book. So now when people come to me and they say, hey, how can I show up better for the disability community? I want to show them the manifesto art, and I say, what statement or statements on here resonate with you? And that is an invitation to either check out the chapter in the book or go do your own research online and engage with our community and our work in that way.
Oh, I honestly, you've wrapped that up in such a nice little bow. I couldn't love it more. I'm also an art girly as well. I did history of art at uni. So the fact that this all kind of pairs together, this is my perfect day. I'm not even going to lie. I get to interview. We're talking about anti-ableism, and we're talking about art as well. What more can I want out of a day? Literally nothing. But that is absolutely brilliant.
And this is designed by an Afro-Latina disabled artist here in the US named Jennifer White Johnson. And part of why I wanted to bring up the art, or the fact that I even thought about the art in the first place, is you and I don't know how old you are, but I am a millennial, and which means that it wasn't until I was an adolescent that I started to have access to digital devices. And as someone who became a digital native in my adulthood, I understand that a piece of art gets hung up on your wall, becomes a conversation, gets shared digitally across social media. A book sits on your shelf and we love it. And sometimes you love the cover and want to share that, but it doesn't tell you that much. And so I just love that the manifesto art becomes a conversation starter, and no matter who you are.
I love that so much. I'm going to ask you this question because I think this is really an important one, particularly for you. But what is ableism for you? Like, how would you define ableism?
Ableism is a system of oppression that devalues someone based on the way their body and or mind works.
Oh my God, someone needs to clip that and just like stick it somewhere because it's such a perfect description.
So again, ableism, the devaluing of someone based on the way their body and or mind works. And you can take body and or mind works and replace that with disability if you want. Anti-ableism then is what actions and strategies and policies that can we put in place where we are equitably valuing people no matter the way their body and or mind works.
Yeah.
And so at a baseline level, so much of this work is, can I really assess where I feel like I'm devaluing someone? And again, not placing any shame onto us because society is filling us and reinforcing many of those harmful messages. How can I pattern interrupt that now to say, okay, just because she shakes with her left hand, whatever. And not whatever in a non-caring way, but like, oh, she just shakes her hand with her left hand, right?
Yeah.
And I don't know if listeners can hear the difference in the nuances of the delivery, but it's just, hey, she does this thing differently. And even as I talk about in the chapter where I talk about definitions of disability, one of the definitions that I came across was looking at the etymology of the word and dis as a way of doing something differently. And so disability ultimately just becomes a different way of being or doing.
Yeah.
No negative value judgment attributed to it. And so I take this back to your question around what's ableism. And I guess my dream of living in this anti-ableist world is how can we all coexist with neurodiversity, with all these disabled bodies and minds just existing. And hopefully, if we prioritize access first, again, we will have access intimacy in all spaces. We won't experience that friction of wondering if our access needs are going to be met if we show up in a space.
Yeah. Oh my goodness gracious me. I have absolutely loved this conversation for a whole host of reasons. We've covered so many interesting topics, and I really implore anybody who's listening to go and grab a copy of the Anti-Ableism Manifesto because, yes, it's a whopper of a book, but my goodness gracious me, you will learn so much. And even if you uncover a small bit about yourself, then it's absolutely worth it. And it is genuinely brilliant. And I'm not just saying that because you're sat opposite me on this podcast, but it's an absolute feat of work. And I really think everybody should go and have a read of it and learn something from it, because there's no way that you wouldn't be able to learn anything from it. My final question, Tiffany, and it's the one that I like to end this podcast with, is, are you disabled and proud?
Yes. And I guess I'll share that what makes me really proud to be disabled is to be part of such a beautiful community that's filled with culture and history and movers and shakers and magic and possibility.
Yeah. And that is perfectly sums up the disabled community. Like, it really interesting, completely like off the cuff fact is that I actually have the word magic tattooed above my elbow, which is like where my arm stops. And I got that done way before I delved into like this kind of work and this space. And like, I always think about how the disabled community, without it, there would be no such thing as ingenuity. There would be no such thing as creativity. Like, those internal creative forces wouldn't exist because there wouldn't necessarily be like not problems to solve, because it's not a problem to solve, but it's a different way of looking at life and having like a different strategy. So being disabled and being proud to be disabled is absolutely magical. And like I said, I have really loved this conversation. It's been the highlight of my afternoon. So thank you so much for reaching out, because I've absolutely loved it.
I'm so excited. And actually it was my PR team that found you. And she said,
Wild.
"Oh, like we came across this Disabled and Proud podcast and we think you should be on it, but we can't find her contact information anywhere. Do you think you could message her on Instagram or LinkedIn or something?" And so then the beauty of social media, which is again how a lot of disabled people find each other.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Oh, this has just been wrapped up. A nice little present with a big fat bow. You are all so welcome. But Tiffany, thank you so much for coming on Disabled and Proud. I've said it before, I'll say it again. I've loved this conversation. I absolutely love the Anti-Ableism Manifesto. I love everything about it. I love the artwork that you include as well. Like, absolutely massive hats off to you, because it's a huge piece of work and it's incredible. Really well done.
Thank you.